Our topic tonight is in our interest. How defending human rights benefits us all. It's the title of a book which Dr. Schultz has written and which was recently published. And it's a provocative and interesting title. We Americans have a very strong strain, as all of you know, of moralism and legalism. And what runs through our society is treated by many scholars, the realists of international politics, as something which often blinds us to the moral and practical imperatives of straightforward national interest. And very often, the poles of moralism and idealism on one hand and national interest on the other are juxtaposed, and a great divide is created. One of the fascinating things about the title of this evening's talk and Dr. Schultz's presentation is, of course, his book, is, of course, the effort to reconcile those two concepts. We're absolutely delighted to have this particular topic addressed. Dr. Schultz is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Oberlin College. He received a Master's of Arts in Philosophy from the University of Chicago. His Doctor of Ministry degree is from the Meadville Lombard Theological School at the University of Chicago. He is an ordained Unitarian Universalist minister. He served with the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations for 15 years. He was the president of that organization for the last 8 years that he was with it. He became president of Amnesty International USA in 1994. He has been a very active supporter of the causes of social justice internationally and locally. He's been a strong defender of women's rights. He's been an opponent of the death penalty, a defender of gay and lesbian rights, and racial equality. It's been a very activist career, a very thoughtful career. He's published widely. He's served on the boards of numerous charitable institutions and civic-spirited institutions. He's written several books, and as I said, the most recent is that which gives title to this evening's presentation. It's a fascinating subject. It's my great pleasure to present to you Dr. William F. Schultz.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. I must say, I am terribly impressed that you could reel all that off without a single note. I don't think I could have done that myself, and that's the sign of a real professional. It always is a pleasure for me to speak at councils, World Affairs Councils, Councils of Foreign Relations, because clearly this is a select group of people, those of you, those Americans who care about the world beyond our shores. I was introduced to the Kansas City Council a year or so ago by their president there, who told a lovely little story of a mother cat and her 3 kittens who had been walking along the street one day when a large and vicious dog came up. And naturally the kittens were frightened, but the mother cat just arched her back and hissed and said to the dog, "Bow wow, bow wow," and the dog turned and ran away. And the kittens, very impressed with their mother, looked up admiringly, and she looked down at them and she said, you see, my darlings, that's the advantage of knowing a second language. But how many Americans, either literally or metaphorically, know a second language, know about the world beyond our shores? Not too many. And so I always do what I can to accommodate invitations from the councils, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I'm also grateful to the council and to Barnes & Noble for having my little book out there for sale, which you're more than welcome to pick up afterwards, and I'll increase its value immensely with a signature in it for you. You know, having this opportunity may preclude me from having to write in my journal tonight what Henry David Thoreau wrote in his, the night that his publisher returned to him 706 of the 1,000 published copies of A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. And that night, Thoreau confided to his journal, "I have a library of 900 volumes, 700 of which I wrote myself." You know, I often think it's, I suppose, better to have one's work ignored than subjected to the kind of withering criticism that T.S. Eliot aimed at a poetic couplet composed by one of his contemporaries. Of the 2 lines of poetry, Eliot said, "They're all very nice, though there are dull stretches." Now, as one who has labored in the human rights vineyards for more than 30 years, I know that hearing about the travails of our fellow human beings can also get pretty tedious at times. It's been called compassion fatigue. But what it boils down to is this: reading at the breakfast table about the decapitation of a family of 19 in Algeria is simply not a pleasant way to start the day. Most of us have enough troubles in our lives as it is. As the Zen saying has it, after ecstasy, the laundry. And if household chores aren't bothersome enough, consider that of all the worries that the average American has on his or her plate, 31% of Americans tell pollsters that they actually spend time worrying that heaven will be boring. And so the question then is how we fit into this litany of Americans' worries. Concerns about what is happening to strangers far away, strangers often of a different race or class or color. And the traditional answer of the human rights activist is that we appeal to Americans' moral consciences. I once visited a prison in Liberia. I met a young man there whose body was covered from head to toe in red dots. "What happened to you?" I asked. "Oh," he said, I stole the radio, I admit it. And when the soldiers captured me, they forced me to lie down in a bed of red ants and held me there at bayonet point for over an hour." Now, I doubt whether any of us has had to spend an hour in a bed of red ants, but even so, we can conjure up an imagination of what that experience would be like, and we don't like the idea one bit. And if we don't like it for ourselves, we can't very well like it for anyone else. It's the immoral imagination at work. And the basic reason why Americans ought to support human rights, of course, the basic reason is because violations of those rights are morally wrong. But sometimes, of course, our imaginations fail us. Sometimes it's pretty difficult to identify with the victims of those human rights violations. If that young boy had not just stolen a radio, but had he raped a pregnant woman, for example, or massacred a group of children, we might be tempted to believe that red ants were only too good for him. In order to identify with another person's plight, in order to have the immoral imagination kick into gear, we have to be willing to include that person in the category human being, at least in our minds. But a young man who once guided me through the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, the third holiest site in Islam, assured me that Jews do not breathe, eat, or defecate in the same fashion that normal human beings do. And an Israeli public official, conversely, once wrote Amnesty International a letter in which he referred to Palestinians this way: "They do not," he said, "feel pain the way average human beings do, because they are nothing but animals." And so because our moral imaginations fail us, we also have need to resort to law. And of course, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is regarded as a form of customary law, is the basis for which all human rights law and covenants, treaties, and conventions have grown. And so a second reason Americans should support human rights is because violations of those rights are against the law. But let's face it, Americans, including the American government and American courts, have not ever proven themselves to be high aficionados of international law. And the moral claims of human rights, while often dramatic and compelling for a period of time, tend to appeal to a limited segment of the population and for a limited period of time. You know, it may be paradoxical for a member of the clergy, such as myself, to admit it, but just as Mrs. Robert A. Taft was correct when she observed that if you laid end to end all the people who fall asleep in church, they'd be a lot more comfortable. So it's true, so similarly it is true, that if you laid end to end all the people who are willing to rearrange their lives to stop the Chinese, for example, from applying an electric shock baton to a 15-year-old Tibetan nun's ears or teeth, they might stretch to fill a city block if they were very tall people. The fact is that morality on the one hand and international law on the other are two pretty feeble reeds upon which to balance a movement for human rights, at least if we have any desire to attract the interest and the loyalty of large numbers of mainstream Americans who've never heard of the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs. So in addition to making the moral and legal arguments, what the human rights movement requires, if it is ever to become a major force in American culture, similar to the power of the environmental movement, for example, or indeed of the women's movement, is to be willing to answer the question from an average American, so what do these problems have to do with me? And that was the question that a Knoxville, Tennessee talk show host put to me a number of years ago. We had been discussing human rights atrocities in Burma and Bosnia, China, Chechnya, Chiapas. I'm sure we all agree, the host said. I'm sure all of my listeners agree that these terrible things you've been describing are morally repugnant, but tell me now, if I'm barely scratching out a living in East Tennessee, worried about having enough money to get the kids a decent education or to pay my mortgage, what difference do all these abuses make to me? I thought it was a very good question. It was also a question that most of us in the human rights movement, so convinced of the moral righteousness of our cause, are rarely willing to stop to try to answer. And so I wrote this little book in an attempt to convince that hard-pressed East Tennesseer that human rights really are connected to his or to her personal interest and connected to our national interest as a country, because the book is aimed not just at the general public, but also at a very select but very influential group of foreign policy analysts, diplomats, business people, journalists, who have appropriated for themselves the sobriquet realists, in contrast to we flabby-minded do-gooders, and who argue that U.S. foreign policy should be driven solely by what they claim to be in our national interest, and that the pursuit of human rights rarely advances that national interest. The grandpappy of so-called realism is the renowned diplomat George Kennan, who has said that the U.S. government should stop advocating democracy and human rights, get out of the business altogether because, and now I quote, "we simply have more important things to do," unquote. So the question that this book asks is, how realistic are the realists anyway? Samia Sarwar was a 26-year-old Pakistani woman who had been separated from her vulgar, alcoholic, abusive husband for many months when she met another man, a kind and gentle man, and she decided to get a divorce. But when she put the proposition to her parents, they forbade it absolutely. And so after several months of struggle, Samia finally fled her parents' home in the city of Peshawar to seek the protection in the city of Lahore of Pakistan's most prominent woman lawyer, a woman by the name of Hina Jalani. Samia's parents followed her to Lahore, But when, after several weeks more of entreaty, she refused to return home, they finally relented and agreed that she could be divorced. And Samia's mother, who was a physician by profession, agreed to meet Samia and Hina in Hina's office, the office of Samia's lawyer, to transfer the necessary papers. Finally, the years of terror will be over, Samia thought, as she waited in her lawyer's office to see her mother. But when the old woman arrived, she was walking on the arms of a stranger. Hina Jelani was alarmed. "Who is that man?" she said. "Oh," said the mother, he is my helper. I have injured my leg. I cannot walk, and he is simply here to..." And at that very moment, the man unloaded a full pistol into Samia Sarwar's skull. Now, when she died in Hina Jelani's arms, Samia Sarwar joined hundreds of women who are killed every year for the so-called honor of their families. She joined thousands of girls and women who are victims of acid burnings and dowry killing. She joined hundreds of thousands of women subjected to forced trafficking for sexual purposes, 50,000 of them trafficked every year into the United States for purposes of being forced into prostitution. She joined between 85 and 114 million women at risk of female genital mutilation. Now, what could the fates of all these women possibly have to do with us? Well, now, a foreign policy realist would say, that story of Samia Sarwar, sad story, poor girl, but really very little connection with America's national interest. And yet, isn't it obvious that women who cannot control their own bodies, cannot control their reproductive decisions, cannot control their children's futures or influence them as fully as they would want to? And so unless we care nothing about, well, say a booming world population with its attendant water scarcity and pollution, unless we care nothing about perpetuating the violence, the hopelessness that leads children to become, yes, terrorists, unless we care nothing about this, we would be fools to think that Samia Sarwar's fate has no connection to our own. Let me give you several more examples of how the denial of other people's rights have a profound negative effect on Americans' own interests. And then you tell me how realistic you think it is that we ignore the harm that comes to others and think we can suffer no ill consequences ourselves. You know, we Americans are accustomed to disparaging our politicians, and God knows many of them deserve it. When I lived in Massachusetts, I was acquainted with a Massachusetts state senator who got on the radio one night and in loud and fervent tones proclaimed, "The Republican octopus is spreading its testicles across the entire Commonwealth." But we rarely stop to think that politics, as we understand it in this country, in terms of trades and compromises, deals, that's part of what keeps us free and stable as a people. The political scientist T.V. Smith once said, "It is the job of the politician to keep the saints and their respective followers from slaughtering one another over matters of moral principle." Consider that none of the countries in which U.S. soldiers have seen action in the last 12 or 15 years, Iraq, Somalia, Haiti, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, not a single one of them ever witnessed a baby-kissing politician. Not a single one of them ever suffered a campaign finance scandal. Because not a single one of them was a participating, human rights-respecting democracy. It's a commonplace to observe that no democracy has ever fought a war against another democracy, and whether that's true depends on your definition of democracy, but it is certainly true that the more respect for human rights you find in a country, the more stable that country is likely to be, the less inclined it is to settle its international disputes violently, the more likely it is to maintain its international agreements, and the less likely it is to harbor terrorists. Unfortunately, the events of September 11th provide a perfect example of the thesis of my book. For what is the connection between human rights and terrorism? Well, take the fertile soil out of which those who flew the plains on September 11th apparently grew, namely Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Both of those countries are rife with corruption. Said the well-connected Saudi ambassador to the U.S., Prince Bandar, if you tell me that building this whole country we misused or corrupted $50 billion, I tell you, yes, so what? We did not invent corruption. Both of these countries display massive differentials in wealth. Both are renowned for the brutality with which they treat their residents, their citizens, and neither one of them provides nonviolent, democratic, human rights respecting means through which their people can express frustrations and change their governments. Egypt and Saudi Arabia are awash in young people. More than 55% of the people are under 25 years of age in Egypt. In Saudi Arabia, the number is 60%. Unemployment among such young people is high in both countries. Where do they turn for meaning and direction, absent nonviolent channels through which to make their needs and voices heard? Well, far too often the answer has been that they turn to the hate-filled messages of religious extremists. Part of that message has been that the United States props up so-called Muslim tyrants like the president of Egypt, Mr. Mubarak, and the Saudi royal family, whether to maintain control in the Middle East, whether to protect our oil interests, it doesn't matter. But this charge, whether it's true or not, it finds receptive ears throughout the region. Bernard Lewis, who is perhaps our foremost scholar on Islam, put it this way: Middle Easterners increasingly complain that the United States judges them by different and lower standards than it does Europeans and Americans. They assert that Western leaders repeatedly overlook or defend actions or support rulers that they would not tolerate in their own countries. Now, how much easier it would be to refute that charge and in the process win considerable sympathy on the so-called Arab street if the United States had made the pursuit of human rights in places like Egypt and Saudi Arabia a more virile and visible part of our foreign policy. The same is true of our actions here at home. This war is being fought in the name of preserving American values, and high among those values is respect for the rule of law. To the extent to which the United States respects international humanitarian law, as we, I think, in large measure tried to do in Afghanistan, to that extent we will gain the respect of people of goodwill in all countries. But if here at home we sacrifice that commitment to human rights in our treatment of those detainees, for example, who are held without charge, if we torture those detainees, as the FBI has suggested may be necessary, or deport them to countries that routinely torture suspects, if indeed we fail to accord to the prisoners at Guantanamo Bay the full protection of prisoners of war, not because we have sympathy for them, but in order to protect the rule of law and in the long run protect our own military servicemen and women too, if in short we sacrifice a fundamental commitment to human rights here at home, the result will not just be some moral quagmire, important as that is, the result will be a compromise of the very thing in whose name this struggle is presumably being waged. And the result of that will be the alienation of thousands of people who would otherwise look on this country with admiration and respect. The reaction of one Mauritanian who was taken into custody shortly after September 11th, held for 40 days, beaten in jail, finally released without charge, his reaction is typical. This is what he said: "I used to love the United States, but now I don't understand it. I was going to learn English, but now I don't want to ever speak it again." So the first reason that human rights are in our national interest is because protecting human rights indeed advances our national security. And if nothing else emerges from those horrible events of September 11th, perhaps what will emerge is a recognition of our interdependence with the interests of others around the world. But what about our economic interests? Are human rights in our economic interests? Well, they certainly are in the economic interests of the 500,000 Americans who lost their jobs in the manufacturing sector in 1999 because U.S. businesses moved their factories to countries that deny workers the right to organize labor unions. A unionized worker in New York is paid $8.31 an hour to make a T-shirt. A non-unionized worker in Bangladesh is paid 1 cent an hour. But it's not just labor that suffers when foreign countries abuse human rights. In late March of this past year, ExxonMobil announced that it was shutting down its natural gas fields in the province of Aceh, Indonesia, because of violence in that province. Violence that was prompted by years and years of political repression and the denial of basic human rights. And what about our public health interests? Is our health in jeopardy when rights are violated around the world? When the door to a Russian prison cell is open, said Sir Nigel Rodley, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, when the door to a Russian prison cell is open, one is hit by a blast of hot, dark, stinking gas, sweat, urine, feces that passes for air. Now, what could the denial of the basic human right to an elementary level of medical care in Russian prisons thousands and thousands of miles from Baltimore possibly have to do with us? Well, very simply, the result of the medical neglect of Russian prisoners is that a strain of tuberculosis that cannot be cured by drugs has been generated in those prisons, and thanks to trade and travel transported around the world until today, it is found here in the United States. Well, if there is any truth at all then to my thesis that the human rights of people, even in countries far, far away, are intimately connected with our national interest, if there's any truth at all to that, then why are foreign policy realists so reluctant to deny that? Are they simply indifferent to human suffering? Well, partly their reluctance stems from a genuine belief that the United States is the exceptional nation, a city set on a hill, as our Puritan forebears put it, a beacon of hope and righteousness after which the rest of the world ought to model itself. And if you are the standard setter, you don't always have to play by the standards you have set. Last year in Foreign Affairs magazine during the last presidential campaign, Condoleezza Rice, now the National Security Advisor, wrote this remarkable sentence. A Bush foreign policy, she said, will be driven by our national interests and not by the interests of an illusory international community. I've wondered whether anyone has read back that sentence to Condoleezza Rice as she and the President so appropriately and so urgently seek the support and the alliance of that illusory international community. How realistic is it, in a world in which trade and electronic communication has bound us more closely than ever, to think that our national interests can ever be formulated independently of the interests of the rest of the world? So if American exceptionalism is so short-sighted, why do realists disdain the struggle for human rights? Are they just indifferent to human suffering? Well, for a while I thought that was true. I suppose of some of them it could be true. But I had an experience with David Trimble, the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, the First Minister of Northern Ireland, that made me think that perhaps many realists, like Trimble, who is hard-headed, tough, a realist to the core, that perhaps many of them are not so much indifferent to human suffering, but, like the rest of us, simply overwhelmed by it. I had visited one of Trimble's constituents, a Catholic family named Hamill, whose young son had been beaten to death by a Protestant mob as the Royal Ulster Constabulary sat across the street and did nothing. The case, as you can imagine, had become emblematic for the Catholic community. And when I met with the First Minister, Mr. Trimble had been carrying on for many minutes his customary rant against the Catholics. And when I raised the Robert Hamill case, he took off on an indictment of the dead boy's character. It was somehow this young man's fault that those 19 Protestant mobsters had beaten him to death. And so, getting nowhere, I decided to change my tack. "Mr. Minister," I said, as quietly as I could, and I put my right hand on his left forearm. "Mr. Minister," I said, you may be right. I don't know the full facts of the Hamill case. But I do know that there is in that house a mother, father, sister, who are in deep mourning for a beloved son. And I do know that as First Minister, you are now no longer just the leader of the Ulster Unionist Party. You are the leader of this whole country. And if Northern Ireland is ever to heal, if any country is ever to heal, it will only be because people in your position reach out across the barriers of the mind to the regions of the heart. Mr. Minister," I said, I know it's a lot to ask of you. Foolish, perhaps, of me even to say, impossible. But is there any chance at all, that you could find it in your heart to reach out to that suffering family? They are, after all, members of your own constituency. To reach out to that suffering family, even though, I do admit it, they are Catholics, as simply one frail and fragile mortal human being to another. And when I had finished, something rather remarkable happened. The room was still, and David Trimble's eyes filled with tears. The tears didn't spill over, and he was quick to catch himself and revert to his more familiar, customary, and no doubt comfortable authoritarian style. But I was so surprised that 20 minutes later, as our conversation wove to a close, I repeated my question in very similar words, and once again his eyes became misty, and he averted my gaze and literally pushed me out of the office. I think for many realists, what appears at first as hard-heartedness is in fact a protection against feeling all the pain they see around them, all the pain every single one of us would see around us if we have the courage to look. Of the Romanian aphorist E.M. Chorin, it was said, "He did not see Auschwitz and despair. He cultivated a feeling of despair about life in order not to truly have to see Auschwitz." Well, let me conclude these remarks before we have some questions and answers together. Let me conclude the remarks, as indeed I do my book, with a confession. When I had almost completed the manuscript, I summarized its thesis to a friend, and her reaction startled me. "What a shame you wrote that book," she said. "To think that we need selfish reasons to care about our fellow human beings." Well, and I certainly understood what she meant. I wish it were enough to tell people that in early 20th century Congo, Belgian labor bosses cut off the hands of boys who had not met their mining quotas for diamonds. And then, to show how strict they were, the Belgian labor bosses kept baskets full of those severed hands displayed on their desks in their offices. I wish that the revulsion that that story evokes had been enough to motivate people to stop parallel atrocities that were going on until very recently, at least in Sierra Leone, fueled by the sale of the diamonds that we purchase for our loved ones. Wish it were enough, but it was not. I've spent a professional lifetime trying to convey the truth about human suffering that it might touch another's heart, and sometimes I've been successful, but not frequently enough. Not frequently enough to rescue the tortured and the dying from the throes of perfidy. Obviously, on some level, I accept my failure and my limitations. It would be the height of hubris if I did not. But I tell you, what I simply cannot accept are those who tell us, like George Kennan, that it doesn't matter, and that this great and powerful country of ours ought to offer its hand to anguish only in the most limited of circumstances. And my book argues that those circumstances are far wider than we think, because when it comes to human rights, honor and benefit coincide. When Alexander Verdovsky, who was the editor of the Russian journal Novy Mir, read for the first time Solzhenitsyn's staggering account of life in Stalin's slave labor camps in the novel Ivan Denisovich, when Verdovsky read that novel for the first time, he was lying in bed at night, and at the end of chapter 2, he got out of bed and he put on his tuxedo and he sat up at his desk reading the book the rest of the night. The next day, he explained himself to a friend. You see, he said, I just thought it would have been an insult to the victims to read that book in my pajamas. Well, ultimately, I don't care why we staunch another's suffering, whether for moral reasons or legal or pragmatic, doesn't matter to me. I don't care, just that we do it. But I do want us to remember this, that we are charged. We are charged when the world throws the very worst it has at us, as indeed it will. We are charged to don our gowns, to put on our ties and our tails in order to meet that worst at our very best. Just that. That's what human rights are all about, to meet the worst at our very best. Just that. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So now I would be very happy to hear comments and questions from you. The question or the comment has to do with the importance not just of sympathizing with the victims, but also, of course, going after those who perpetrate the crimes and ending impunity for those crimes. And, of course, Amnesty, as an organization which has attempted to stand for the end to impunity for its 42 years of existence, would certainly agree with the fundamental thesis of that. Obviously, it's awfully important also how we go about that and making sure that we go about it in a way that doesn't exacerbate the problem. If you end up torturing torturers, you have a serious problem on your hands, but that we need to bring torturers to justice, I would be the last to deny. The question has to do with Amnesty's traditional role of freeing prisoners of conscience. Those are people who are imprisoned or under threat of some kind because of their nonviolent political or religious beliefs. And the gentleman is asking what currently we are doing in that respect. And I will say that that remains a very important part of Amnesty's work. Since Amnesty was founded in 1961, we have freed at least 40,000 prisoners of conscience around the world. We continue to be able to help in between 40 and 60% of the cases that we adopt. One of the things that we have done that is a little different is that we have updated the way in which we do mobilize people to take advantage of new electronic technologies. And so today, for example, we have created through our website something called FAST. Fast Action Stops Torture, because we know that if someone is about to be tortured or imprisoned, if they're about to be tortured in prison, it will happen in the first 48 hours. And so we mobilize people electronically now to deluge governments with the demand that individuals whom we name be protected or released if indeed they deserve to be released. And in the first 8 cases, we've been able to positively affect 6 of them. So we're still very much in the business that you describe. The Question has to do with Amnesty's criticisms of the United States. It is certainly true that Amnesty monitors the United States just as we do 146 other countries around the world. The United States is itself a perpetrator of some human rights abuses, and Amnesty has certainly been critical of various issues related to police brutality, related to the rape of women in U.S. prisons by prison guards or with the connivance of guards. Until Amnesty began a campaign to change state laws in this respect, 2 years ago, it was not even a crime for a prison guard to rape a prisoner, a woman prisoner, in this country in 14 states. Today, that number is down to 2 states in which it is not a crime to rape a woman prisoner. We have certainly, of course, also opposed the death penalty here in the United States. We oppose the fact that the U.S. is the leading manufacturer of torture equipment, that U.S. companies are the largest number of companies in the world that manufactures and exports torture equipment. So indeed, we have been critical of some U.S. practices. At the same time, it's important to say that the U.S. Does have a due process and a judicial system that in many respects is the envy of the world. Question has to do with what an appropriate position towards China would be with regard to human rights. Now, clearly Amnesty has long been very, very critical of the Chinese government and its human rights record. Let's just be clear what the situation is in China. We have at least 230,000 people in prison without trial in China. China executes between 4,000 and 6,000 people, conservatively estimated, every year, often for crimes as petty as stealing bicycles, pinching bottoms, selling fake fertilizer, and then often extracts the internal organs of those prisoners for sale in the public market. Literally thousands of religious leaders, Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, have been imprisoned in China. There are at least 3,000 prisoners of conscience in China. What Amnesty and other human rights groups have asked of the U.S. government is that we simply put as much energy into addressing Chinese human rights violations as we do into seeking protection for trademarks and intellectual property rights. That we care as much about those who are suffering this kind of human rights violation as we do about making sure that our CD-ROMs and videos are not pirated by the Chinese. And what that means is that we engage in concentrated diplomacy, a combination of carrots and sticks in the field of human rights, just as we do quite appropriately in the field of economic relations with China. The U.S. is, of course, not the only player here by any means, and equally important is that other countries that have trade relations do so. It doesn't do any good for the U.S. alone to become virtuous if then the Japanese or the Europeans are going to step in and pick up the Chinese market. So we also put considerable pressure as an international human rights organization on those governments and on corporations themselves. And I would say that I suspect that if the World Trade Organization and other international financial institutions with which China is aligning itself take seriously their obligation to conform human rights standards and environmental standards to other forms of standards that they are enforcing, this will be another important point of leverage with the Chinese. Okay, so the question is, why does the U.S. maintain sanctions on Cuba? But you have asked the wrong person. I mean, I'm not the person to ask why the U.S. maintains sanctions on Cuba. For one thing, Amnesty takes no position one way or the other on sanctions. That's not Amnesty's business. Our business is to monitor the human rights violations in Cuba. What is true is that there are still very profound human rights violations in Cuba of a civil and political nature. The fact is that there are about 200 prisoners of conscience held in Cuban prisons. So if the point of the sanctions has been to create an improved human rights climate in Cuba, that has not been successful. If the point of the sanctions is to punish Cuba in some other way, that's beyond Amnesty's responsibility to analyze. Yes, sir. The gentleman has asked how we pursue human interest, national interest, and human rights through self-interest if the powerful are dealing with the powerful at the expense of the powerless, and when there are common precluding of violations of national sovereignty for intervention purposes. That's a fair summary of your question. Of course, it is true that the powerful are dealing with the powerful, but it is also true, as we starkly have found over the last few months, that we can't ignore the so-called powerless. I was quite interested the other day to see that Wendy Chamberlain, who is the U.S. ambassador to Pakistan, acknowledged that it is clearly in America's national interest to provide jobs and economic welfare to Pakistan. Clearly, in Pakistan, we have a situation which is incredibly unstable, which not only because of our interests in fighting al-Qaeda, but also our interests in precluding a nuclear war in that part of the region, would require us to pay attention to the interests of the powerless in Pakistan. And that is a very interesting example of how our own self-interest is tied into not just the civil and political rights of the Pakistanis, but in that case, the social and economic rights as well. Now, it is true that commonly countries have argued that other countries ought not to intervene in their internal affairs, and indeed the United Nations Charter says that that ought not to happen, but I would say that that principle is gradually being eroded as a recognition of universal human rights standards grows. And the decision certainly by the law lords in the United Kingdom with regard to General Pinochet was a groundbreaking decision in that respect. The decisions that are currently taking place in courts in Belgium, where they are claiming universal jurisdiction and putting on trial some of those who were responsible for crimes in Rwanda, even though the crimes were not committed in Belgium itself. These are examples of the way in which that old principle and the national sovereignty trumping human rights is gradually eroding, and that's an important development. The question has to do with how many prisoners of conscience are in the United States and whether Mumia Abu-Jamal is considered a prisoner of conscience. Mumia is not considered a prisoner of conscience simply because Amnesty has not concluded that Mumia was never involved with violence. Amnesty has called for a new trial for Mumia because we believe he did not receive a fair trial. But we have not declared him a prisoner of conscience, because a prisoner of conscience is someone whom we have to be convinced was not involved in the use of violence or the advocacy of violence. Under that definition, there are not any prisoners of conscience in the United States, though there certainly are people like Leonard Peltier whose, in our judgment, should be released because they have been imprisoned unfairly. They should either be given a new trial, or in Peltier's case, our opinion is after 22 years he should be released. But there are not technical prisoners of conscience in the United States at the moment. The question has to do with whether Amnesty takes a position on the one-child policy in China. This, of course, is the policy that limits couples to having one child in most cases and forces them to have abortions if they become pregnant beyond that limit. Amnesty takes no position, I should say, first on the question of abortion per se, one way or the other. That is not an issue that we get involved with. But we do certainly oppose forced abortions. And while we don't oppose the one-child policy per se, to the extent to which it requires people to be forced to have abortions, then we would consider it a violation of human rights. The question has to do, forgive me for not being able to fully summarize your perspective. The question has to do with how we balance the fact that sometimes if human rights regimens are enforced, it may result in the overthrow of governments, the coming to power of forces that may be even more repressive than the government currently in power, and therefore the committing of greater human rights crimes in the long run. Is that a fair summary of your? Okay. Let me say first that I don't mean to suggest that how we implement the fundamental position that I'm advocating is always a simple equation by any means. And my remarks here are designed first to establish a framework that I think is missing within our fundamental foreign policy. And it is not to say that the way in which we then go about implementing or promoting human rights or defending human rights are always simple. And of course, there are calculations that have to be taken into account. My position is, however, that respect for human rights is the best guarantee guarantor in the long run of stability and democracy in a country, whether it be Egypt or any other. My position is that in general, the repression of human rights makes for greater stability rather than less. And so let's take Saudi Arabia, for example, one of the most repressive countries in the world. My position is that if in Saudi Arabia, through respect for human rights, the Saudi government had begun to allow responsible mainstream voices of dissent and democracy able to reach the people through the media and through alternative political parties, those mainstream parties might well have been able to provide mechanisms through which those who have ultimately been drawn to hate-filled parties of extremism could express their views nonviolently. I think there is at least every bit as much chance of believing that that will happen as believing that repression works over the long run. Because the fact is this: the Saudi government is one of the most unstable governments in the world. Thanks to all of its repression, the Saudi government is likely to fall within the next 6 months to 2 years. And when it falls, is there a chance that radical forces will take over? You bet. There certainly is. And would that chance have been vitiated if there had been democratic means of expressing resentment? I can't guarantee that, but I believe there's at least every bit as good a chance that it would as that the radicals will take over thanks to repression. And that's why I think that it is ultimately almost always short-sighted not to do everything we can to encourage the building of democracy and respect for human rights. I don't mean to say that the United States can wave a magic wand, but I do mean to say that as we calculate our oil interests, we ought to have taken into account other interests as well, including our national security interests, which I think would have been extremely well advanced had we encouraged Saudi Arabia to come to greater respect for human rights far earlier. Will the U.S. ever be able to satisfy Amnesty International, and how can you as individuals contribute to promoting human rights? First of all, I will say this. There's only one country that, to my knowledge, has never been cited by Amnesty International for a human rights violation, and that's Iceland. And so I suspect that the United States and most countries in the world it will be a long day before they entirely satisfy human rights regimens. But that doesn't mean, of course, that it isn't worth doing everything we can to promote that. And there are relatively simple ways to do that. One, of course, is to become involved in an organization like Amnesty through our local chapters, through our student chapters, through our various networks, which can be joined electronically, through our website at www.amnestyusa.org. There are a whole series of opportunities there to be involved in Amnesty's work. And of course, there are many other very fine human rights organizations as well that do important work, all of which you can reach through the websites. What country has been particularly effective in working to encourage human rights outside its borders? Well, let me say this. First of all, Amnesty is very cautious not to rate countries or to give countries imprimaturs of approval. After all, it's hard to make a judgment with one country that may be doing quite well in one area of rights and quite poorly in another. How do we weigh one more than the other? But I will say that in general, the European Union, not to name just one country, but I will say that in general, the European Union has taken more and more seriously its human rights obligations, is, for example, forcing Turkey in exchange for the possibility of the country of Turkey becoming a member of the European Union, is forcing Turkey to re-examine its human rights record. And Turkey is, in fact, beginning to make some significant changes in that respect. I will say that I think we all applaud President Mbeki of South Africa's denouncing of President Mugabe of Zimbabwe's recent turn towards authoritarianism. And certainly Mbeki in that one respect, perhaps not in others, but in that respect is doing significant work on behalf of human rights in Southern Africa. So there, and I could cite other individual examples. Yes, sir. The question is, what do we do if a political administration doesn't care about human rights? You know, frankly, I don't care whether they don't care. I only care that they recognize that human rights is in America's national interest. And I think that there is a growing recognition of that fact, whether it's by this administration or any other. think that there is a developing evolutionary process. Bill Clinton, to cite the example that you used, had on his conscience quite appropriately the U.S.'s discouragement of the United Nations from stopping the genocide in Rwanda. That was one of, I would say, one of the most atrocious things that an American president has ever done. And it should be on that man's conscience. On the other hand, I agree with you that perhaps having learned that lesson, President Clinton did take action in the Kosovo war that was designed, we can debate whether it was appropriate or not, but was designed at least to protect Kosovar refugees. I am not interested in getting into a partisan discussion of various presidencies. The fact is that in some respects, President Reagan, whether it was because of anti-communism or not, the man did take some significant steps to protect Russian dissidents. He, for example, when he went to Moscow, he visited with Russian dissidents. No American president had ever done that before, and that played a significant role in freeing up the situation in which Russian dissidents found themselves. So I am interested not in the partisan politics of this issue. I am interested in how we can convince all political leaders that this is in the U.S.'s interest and that we can leverage their desire to promote America's national interests into a recognition that the human rights are a part of that. Let me go over here. Yes, sir. We certainly, of course, support the right of all people, and certainly of women, to have access to information. We don't take a position one way or the other on abortion for a very simple reason. Amnesty International bases its position on as best we can determine the consensus positions of the international human rights community with regard to issues that are adjudicated before international courts of various different kinds. The issue of abortion is not one that has been adjudicated upon which there is broad international consensus. And because of that, it is simply outside the realm of the issues upon which Amnesty takes a position or acts. Doesn't mean, of course, that we in any way oppose a woman having access to information. In fact, of course, that is the right. But what she chooses to do with it, we take no position when it comes to the question of abortion.
I don't think there's any support for me ending this session this evening, but it's my job to do so. I think there are an awful lot of interesting questions left to explore, but I think we're all appreciative of the conviction and the decency and the grand objectives which have been articulated tonight so well and so clearly. We very much appreciate this opportunity, and thank you. Thank you.